Hey everybody, Joshua here. So it's only been 2 months since my last rack update, but I've been quite a busy bee over the last 2 months and completed quite a few upgrades that I'd been planning for several months and several years actually for some of these. So I wanted to do a kind of different style video. The last one I compared basically what had changed between the video 2 years before that, but this time I'm just going to give an entirely fresh take of everything that's in there, not really compare it to the past. So yeah, please join me on my tour, and I just want a quick disclaimer that this video I was planning to record today anyways has nothing to do with any other events that went on today, or spikes in popularity or anything of that matter. So we'll start here. So we got the door to the room. I've got some soundproofing panels on the outside of the door, mostly just to help deaden the room a little bit. But as I open it up here, we'll see the full rack in all its glory with one side panel missing for now. I still have a little bit of work left to do on that. So I'll turn around here. First thing I want to point out is that this room, the wall is uninsulated, which has been a little bit of a pain over time due to the noise in this room. So I recently put some soundproofing panels on it, and it does quite an amazing job for being just these lightweight foam panels that you can kind of lean on and tend to fall off the wall. Nothing a little tape and super glue can't fix. But yeah, they do a great job, so I can sit at my desk, which is just on the other side of that wall there, and barely even hear this room, and can't even hear it at all over by my TV. For a while I used egg crates, but they didn't work very well. So, if you're ever debating something like this, let it be known that egg crates don't really work all that well. So I'll turn around here. So let's do cooling first, of course. So this is my trusty Toshiba 12,000 BTU air conditioner. I've had it for, about 4 years now, a little under 4 years, and it continues to run strong. It runs pretty much all the time to, keep this room cool, but I'm hoping that will change in the near future with some final plans I have for the cooling in here. But yeah, it's got a dedicated intake on the hot side, so it's pulling in fresh air from outside and it's exhausting it outside as well, so it's about as efficient as a portable air conditioner unit can be. And then I also have a tube for the intake to the cold side, which isn't really connected to anything right now, but the goal is to actually connect it to those fans on the front of the rack here in order to actually, move the air into the right place, so to speak. So because the side panel's off, we can actually look here and see what I did with the fans. So the hot air is just, blown and kept separate from the rest of the rack and blown out the front. So yeah, that gets me to the front of the rack here. So I'll just do a quick little, sweep from the top to the bottom, and then I'll go through each device in turn. So, of course, there's fans at the top exhausting that hot air. Below that, we have my patch panels. So 240 or 224 port patch panels. So my patches here are pretty consistent. I have them color coordinated based on function. So first of all, I have 4 orange connections, which are for my internet, aka WAN connections. So I've actually got 3 internet connections, 3 different physical medias. One's DOCSIS cable, one's fixed wireless, and one is DSL. So it's excessive even for me, but they provide redundancy with each other, and I load balance the upstream bandwidth because neither one is particularly fast on the upstream, and I need as much upstream bandwidth as I can get, hosting servers out of my house. So the 4th one's just basically unused. And the same idea, the next one's the green connections here. These are wireless access points. So again, I only have 3, but there's 4 connections. So the first 2 are Unify UAP AC Pros. I have one down here actually sitting on top of the rack that I'll show in a sec, and one upstairs in the front of my house. And those 2 are able to provide full coverage over my house. They give me AC wireless, which, for me is more than fast enough for all my devices. And, I've been happy with it. It took 10 years to finally get a Wi-Fi system that actually covered my house without dead spots, and these Unify units do it. The 3rd port is actually a much older Unify device. It's a Unify UAC LR, which the Unify Control Center loves to complain is obsolete. But it's just BNN, but I use it for home automation devices. So I have about 20 to 24-ish home automation devices, various smart switches, smart plugs, ES Presence ESP32 devices all around the house that kind of track my location and of course control lights and all that stuff. So that access point's, you know, just dedicated for those. And the fourth port will probably be a second one of those that I've had, you know, since I got them. That'll probably go upstairs, the same place as my AC. Eventually. I haven't really needed it yet, but I might in the future. And I'll just show them. There's the two sitting up there. One's the LR. I think this one's the UC, and that one's the LR, or the AC and the LR. All right, so next up we got two blue connections that are just wired links to my desk. They're not actually connected to anything yet, but in case I want to, you know, plug my laptop in with a wired connection occasionally, I'll be able to do that with those ports. And then we get into the routers. So there's two yellow connections that are kind of management ports to my routers, and then I've got the two pairs of trunk ports, LACP bonding, of course, for redundancy. And those are kind of the main trunk ports into my routers. So, you know, internet connections come in, and each of those is on a VLAN, and then these are the trunks that have the internet VLANs and all the other network VLANs on them. So continuing on, I got the 16 yellow connections here. So yellow connections are the management network. And these go to various devices in the rack on the management network. So all of the, you know, IPMI BMCs of all the servers, the iDRACs, or, you know, other similar things. And also just a few devices that I'll show off in a bit that are also on that management network. And last but not least, there's a set of 4 white trunk connections that I created or that I wired in for the purpose of doing a testing hypervisor cluster, which isn't actually up or connected yet, but, you know, I planned for the future when I redid this about a month ago now. So that takes me to the first switch, which is this guy here with the rack ears and all the you know, colored connectors into it. So this is a Quanta LB4M. It's 48 port 1 gigabit switch with 2 10 gigabit uplinks. So this is kind of my main switch. It does, you know, all my main connections at the 1 gig layer, and then uplinks to my second switch, which is this guy here, which is the Quanta LB6M. So this is a 24 port 10 gig switch. And this is what I use for all my servers. So as you can see, I have DAC connections to all of my servers. And like the routers, I have pairs of them, so it's LACP bonded. And all of those go up, you know, through the patch panel as well and distribute down to my servers, which I'll show off when I get inside. Okay, now we're into actual servers, I guess you'd put them. So buried deep inside the rack here on a custom hacky little shelf, I have my two routers. So these guys here are basically, they're just some of those cheap Chinese micro boxes that you can find on AliExpress. After watching a whole bunch of Serve the Home videos on these, I decided to pick 2 up because my previous routers were, you know, power hungry monsters, and these are far more efficient while giving me just as much performance. So inside of them, there's an Intel Celeron N5105, which is a 4-core 2 gigahertz low power processor. I think it's a 10 watt TDP. They got 8 gigs of RAM, 128 gig, you know, cheap NVMe drive just for the system disk, and most importantly, they have these 4 2.5 gigabit ports. So I'm not actually using them at 2.5 gigabit. I'm only using them at 1 gig. But that gives me, you know, you got the 2 trunks. You got a cross connect between them for CARP and PF sync, and the management connection. So these are actually laid out in a bit of a weird way that I think is worth mentioning. So running bare metal on the box, I've actually got Debian Linux, and you'll find that nearly everything I do after this is Debian Linux. Okay, my flash died. I ran out of battery power for that. Yeah, sorry. So there's Debian Linux running on the bare metal there, and then I run a VM on top with FreeBSD in it. It's not pfSense or OpenSense or anything like that. It's just raw FreeBSD 13.1, and I pass in the 3 white connected NICs. So the management port is effectively just the port for the Debian host operating system, and then the other 3 ports get passed directly into this VM that I have configured as a PF firewall, you know, does DHCP and all that fun stuff. And one of the kind of cool things about how my network's laid out, which I won't go into too much detail in this video, but basically I have 3 internet connections, and I also have a remote presence at a data center out by Toronto. So what I actually do is I establish WireGuard VPN tunnels out of these routers to those remote servers in my colo, one out of each of the 3 WAN connections. And then on that side, I have a dedicated public IP block that's routed towards my server. I then forward, using FreeBSD on the remote side there, I then forward all that traffic over these VPN tunnels and terminate it on these routers. So in effect, to the internet, this rack looks like it's sitting in a colo provider out in a data center in Toronto, when in reality it's actually in my house, and I just have, you know, a pair of small servers sitting out in that colo. I found it a pretty ingenious solution. Gets me effectively the visibility, or the, I mean, I get redundancy over it, but I get kind of like the impression to the internet that this isn't in my house, which helps in a lot of ways. You know, I'm not trying to run mail and stuff like that out of a residential IP or set of IPs. Anywho, so that's the routers. So next up, we got another new addition this month. So these are my Ceph nodes. So I got 3 of these boxes. Each of them, so they're basically Dell PowerEdge R720XDs, which are the, you know, extreme density R720 series. So 12 bays on the front, and there's 2.5 bays in the back as well. Each of these guys has in it 2 of the Intel Xeon E5 2697 V2. So those are 12-core 2.7 gigahertz processors. Quite beefy for storage nodes, I know, but Ceph likes its CPU. They've got 64 gigs of RAM in them each. In addition, they've got 2 200 gigabyte Intel DCS 3700 SSDs for their system boot drives, as well as the journaling for Ceph for each of the OSD disks. And then finally, we've got 1 14 terabyte drive and then 6 8 terabyte drives in each one, for a total of 168 terabytes of raw space over the entire, you know, 3 nodes. So I mentioned these are running Ceph. So the purpose of that is it's a distributed object storage system. So in effect, I give it this whole pool of servers and disks, and it just gives me a file system on top that I can mount to my clients. But it's got a whole bunch of redundancy and resiliency built into it. You know, I can lose a drive, I can theoretically lose a node, but in practice there's bugs around that. And just generally, it gives me a highly expandable system. It's not like, say, a ZFS array, where if I tried to stick another disk in here, oh, you can't just grow by 1 disk. With Ceph, you can just, you know, stick disks in. You have to put them in, you know, matched one in each node to really get all the space, but, you know, I can expand fairly dynamically with that setup. And all in all, this provides my bulk storage. So I've got all my Linux ISOs, as well as a whole bunch of my extremely high quality Linux ISOs, I should say, along with all of my, like, shared storage data. So I have, like, all my mailders for my email server on here, and my own cloud system on here, and all that. So I can run redundant VMs, and then the storage is shared with this pool. Okay, next server going down here, we have my backup server. So this guy here it's a white box Chenbro case. I've had this case for a very long time. It has no rack ears, but it does the job. So inside this guy, we've just got a slightly lower end Intel Xeon E3 1245 V2, which is a 4-core 3 gigahertz CPU, 16 gigs of RAM, and a single 800 gigabyte DCS 3700 for the system. And it's got in it 4 8 terabyte Western Digital drives. So the purpose of this is just to handle the backups for my storage cluster and also my VMs, I'll get to in a bit. And I completely forgot to mention, but this node and all the Ceph nodes, as well as the hypervisors I'll get to in a sec, are all 10 gig connected. You know, I mentioned the dual 10 gig ports up on the switch here, so that's what those all go to. So yeah, backup server just handles my nightly backups of everything. So it stores basically not infinite snapshots, but as many snapshots as I can possibly fit on it. So I have a rolling, you know, recoverable backup of anything. And, you know, that's my first level of backups. I have a second level as well. All right, below the backup server, we've got 3 Dell PowerEdge R430 servers. So these are my hypervisor cluster. So these guys have in them a single, I'm only running them in one processor mode. They have a single Intel Xeon E5 2683 V4, which is a 16-core 2.1 GHz processor. They've got 16 gigabytes of RAM. They've got 2 200 gigabyte Intel DCS 3700 drives as their system disks. Are you sensing a pattern with my disks here? And 2 800 gigabyte Intel DCS 3700 disks. They seriously are like the best SSD you can find for like under $500. Endurance out the wazoo. But yeah, so these are my hypervisors. So I actually run a custom hypervisor solution that I wrote myself. It's called PVC. So instead of using tools like Proximox, which I never liked, I tried it several times and hated it every time, or instead of paying for a very, very expensive tool like VMware ESX, or specifically I was basing this off Nutanix, which is, you know, the kind of software that costs you more than the physical servers it runs on, I decided to build my own hyper-converged infrastructure manager. So it's a set of software and daemons that uses a whole bunch of bog standard Linux tools like, you know, Ceph, uses Linux KVM, uses FR routing, and a whole bunch of other things with an Apache Zookeeper database to keep state. And it gives me a fully redundant, self-healing, self-managing virtualization cluster out of 3 nodes. So I could literally, you know, yank one of these nodes, and I would lose VMs for about 60 seconds, and then they'd all come up on the peers, and all the storage is shared. So, you know, each node has a full copy of all the data, you know, all that kind of replication and redundancy and things that make this a true shared cluster. So this is open source software that I've, you know, placed out in the world. I use it with my employer as well. We have it deployed at many of our customers. So it works swimmingly. This is kind of the testing cluster, even though it's my production cluster. So I hope to rectify that in the future. And we'll go down even further here. So this is kind of like the last main server. So this is my base server. So what this actually is more of my desktop. As I mentioned a little bit earlier, I only have a laptop, and you know, that moves around my house. So I close it frequently, so I don't really have, you know, stable connections to anything. So this right here is my kind of like desktop in a cloud. It doesn't actually have a monitor or anything connected to it, but I run shell sessions on it, and I also use it for game streaming. So the case, it's a white box Norco from God knows how long ago, with some decorations on it. It's got an Intel Xeon E5 2620 V4, which is an 8-core 2.1 GHz CPU that I can actually get to boost all the way. I can't get any of the real servers, quote unquote, to boost all the way, but this one will boost all the way. It's got 64 gigs of RAM and 2 512 gigabyte ADATA NVMe drives, one's system and one's data. So gives me nice fast storage for my shells and my games. Again, this has, you know, the 2 gigabit or the 2 dual 10 gigabit connections to it. Last thing to note here, this is my tertiary backup. So I have an external 8 terabyte drive here that I save the really important things off the backup server too. So not only am I taking nightly backups, which have actually started, you can see the orange LED. The orange LED is on constant there. So I take the nightly backups from my main servers onto the backup system, and then I take backups from the backup system onto this drive, snapshots, and I only keep the latest on this backup drive, so if I needed to grab it and run, I could. Alright, and then at the very bottom here, I've got 3 really old HP DL360G6 servers. These are going to be a testing hypervisor cluster if I, you know, bother to set them up again. I don't know, I'd kind of like to not test on my main cluster, but I also haven't been doing any major development work on PVC in the last couple months, so I haven't really needed them. Finally, very bottom, we've got 2 UPSs. So these are some APC Smart UPS 2200 XLs. So they're the big, beefy, large battery ones. They last about, with my load, which is about 50%, they last about 20 minutes. So with fresh batteries. So that's more than enough time for me to, you know, properly shut this whole thing down if there's a power outage, or ride out a small one. And those are connected here. They have a dedicated 20 amp circuit for the 2 of them, which is a little less than I would like, but until I rewire my house panel, you know, that's all I get. Luckily, I'm under that. This whole thing uses about 18 to 1900 watts, you know, all together during steady state. Sometimes it spikes a little bit and I might hit as much as 2000, but, you know, it's fairly reasonable for the sheer amount of gear, I think, at least. And some of my recent, you know, upgrades, you know, more efficient routers, more efficient storage servers, have really made a difference in the power usage. I've dropped about 200 watts. And, of course, the air conditioner I didn't mention, it's on its own circuit, too. So it's got a 15 amp circuit all for it. Alright, so let's open up the door here. I'll show off inside of this thing. So, first of all, you can see the back of the switches and the back of the routers here, and they're my little ingenious DC redundant power supply. So, you know, each of these boxes came with its own power supply. So I kind of cut them off, cut the plugs off, and attach them to a bunch of Molex connectors, as well as the fans on them to those Molex connectors. So effectively I have redundant power. If I lose one of these two power bricks, which are on different the different circuits that I'll show in a second, then I could actually, you know, have redundant power here and not actually have to worry about, you know, losing one of the one of the routers when I lose power. So, you know, back of the servers, lots of power, 1 gig and 10 gig connections, you know, iDRACs and such, and then the 10 gig and then power. This right here is my, like, I've had one of these for a long time. I call it my sweep, which is just all my 1 gig cables that, you know, kind of come from the front and across and sweep down. I have them hanging on ground wire this time. So they're always hanging on something different, but, you know, it does the job, and they distribute out using these 3D printed cable clamps. So yeah, that's all the back of the servers here. So next thing I want to point out is this guy here. So this is one of the devices that I said is connected to the management network. So this is a device I call ENV, short for environment. So it's a Raspberry Pi 3 or 4, I can't remember which one it is. It's a Raspberry Pi device that has its own, you know, backup battery, so it stays on. And the purpose of this guy is to monitor the environment of this rack. So connected to it, I have my UPSs, the 2 that are in this rack, as well as one that goes over an Ethernet cable to my like modems, and those are on their own UPS as well, so I can monitor all of those. And I also have a number of temperature sensors strategically placed around the rack, you know, one at the top here, and there's a couple, one at the exhaust at the front, which you can kind of see up there. And there's 2 on the outside of the rack and 1 on the air conditioner's outlet vent, so I can keep track of the temperatures and the power. I got the, you know, PoE injectors for the various access points, so all those things that go out the back of the rack come down on their own little sweep in front here. And then I have my power distribution. So I just have 4 of these little power strip guys here. They're 15 amp power strips I got from Amazon, and they do the job wonderfully. So there's an A side and an A side and a B side. So the first 2 are A side, the second 2 are B side. And those connect down to the UPSs. So this lets me balance my redundant power supplies, which everything has a redundant power supply except the base server. And it lets me balance them across the 2 circuit, or the 2 UPSs, I should say. They ultimately go to 1 circuit. And that way I can actually have, you know, redundant power supplies, for the most part, redundant power input. So if anything fails, a power supply fails, or a UPS fails, I can keep everything running. Basically running as long as I need to. So yeah, that's the tour of my rack. I hope you found this interesting and enjoyable and learned something about my setup, and I hope to see you again soon.